there. So today we're going to fill in our plant adaptation notes. We will be using packet pages 136, 137, and 138 from our packet. If you haven't done so already, go ahead, cut these out and glue them into your notebook. You can use the table of contents to help you figure out which packet page goes on which notebook page. So let's start back at the beginning. We've already talked a little bit about vascular tissues found in plants, but once again, the vascular tissues are transport tubes. They help move material from one part of the plant to another. It's very similar to how our circulatory system moves oxygen and food through our veins and arteries. Now, there are two types of vascular tissues or tubes that plants use. Xylem tubes are used to move water. So these tubes will take water from the roots and move it up into the trunk and the branches and the leaves. And then phloem tubes will move sugar or the food that the plants make. So xylem tubes will move from the leaves, where photosynthesis is occurring, out into the stems and the branches and the roots. So they're kind of moving in opposite directions from each other. So remember, there are two types of plants that are two categories in which we can sort plants, non-vascular and vascular plants. So non-vascular plants are plants that have no vascular tissues, meaning they do not have xylem or phloem. Some examples of these types of plants are mosses. Remember, mosses are non-vascular because they are very small. They cling to the spot where they are growing. They cannot grow very tall because they do not have the vascular tissues to transport materials far away. So non-vascular plants like mosses tend to be pretty small. And then vascular tissues are plants that do have the vascular tissues. So they do have xylem and phloem. And these are the plants that we're probably more familiar with. Angiosperms would be our flowers, our grasses. Gymnosperms, those are going to be, your deciduous trees. And then, of course, ferns. So these plants can grow very tall and very wide because they do have tissues that can transport materials farther away from the roots. So our equation for photosynthesis, again, a review from a few units ago, but it is very important. So everything to the left of the arrow are the reactants. So this is what the plant needs to bring in. 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water plus sunlight yields 1 molecule of glucose, which is C6H12O6, and then 6 molecules of oxygen. So everything to the left of the arrow are the reactants, or what's being put into the plant. Everything to the right of the arrow are the products, or what is being produced in photosynthesis. So we need to remember where photosynthesis occurs in a plant. Do you remember where? It is the chloroplast, and the chloroplasts are found in leaves. Remember, the chloroplasts contain chlorophyll, which is what makes the chloroplast green. And so leaves are green. So any green part of a plant will contain chloroplast and will therefore perform photosynthesis. And then these are just the different parts of the chloroplast where photosynthesis occurs. So if we take a look at a cross section of our leaf where we kind of break down the different parts of the leaf, we need to make sure we are very familiar with the stoma and the guard cells. Remember, the stoma is a hole in the leaf that allows for the exchange of gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, because plants will bring in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis and then they will release oxygen as a product. So the stoma allows for those gases to be brought in and to leave the plant. And the guard cells, of course, are specialized cells that can open and close the stoma depending on the time of day, depending on the season. Does the plant need to bring carbon dioxide? Does it not? So the guard cells open the stoma or close the stoma. So another adaptation for plants is how plants reproduce. So remember, the purpose of reproduction is to make offspring. Now, depending on the type of plant we're looking at, determines kind of the reproduction we're going to use. So starting with non-vascular plants, our mosses, they reproduce using spores. Now remember, spores are very small seed-like cases that use wind to be distributed. So they're not quite as large or specialized as seeds. So a spore is just a very small reproductive cell. Our first vascular plant is the fern. They will also reproduce using spores. Gymnosperms, which are the conifers, so if you think your Christmas tree, they will reproduce sexually, but they're going to use cones. Remember, gymnosperm means naked seed. So cones that drop down to the forest floor. And then angiosperms will also reproduce sexually, but they reproduce using flowers and fruits. So let's take a closer look at the parts of the flower that we see on angiosperms. So again, we need to make offspring. So let's start with the petal. So most of the flowers that we see, right, they're different colors, yellows and blues and reds. So the purpose of the petal is to attract pollinators. And the color of the petal will attract a different type of pollinator depending on the plant. So if it's a yellow color, we're probably trying to attract bees or moths. If it's more of a reddish color, we're probably trying to attract birds. If the petals are kind of a dull color or maybe even white, we're probably trying to attract bats. And it's not necessarily based on the color, but more of the scent of the petal. So the type of petal is almost specialized for the type of pollinator it's trying to attract. Next, we have the sepal. These are these two smaller leaves that grow underneath the petals. Their job is to protect the flower. They're protecting the ovary, where the actual female reproductive cell is. And then there is the stamen. So the stamen includes both male reproductive parts, the anther up here, and the filament. So the filament just basically holds the anther up, and the anther is what contains the pollen, right? And the pollen is the male reproductive cell. So instead of it being called sperm, we say that it is pollen. So the stamen is both the anther and the filament. It is the male reproductive part, and it produces pollen. And then, of course, we have the carpel, which is sometimes also referred to as the pistil, depending on who you're speaking with. But the carpel has four main parts: the stigma, the style, the ovary, and then of course the actual ovules, or like the eggs themselves. So the stigma is a sticky part right up here. The stigma needs to be sticky so that the pollen can stick to it. So the pollen blows by on a breeze, or maybe a bird comes by to get nectar and it's got pollen on its feathers, and then that pollen gets stuck to the carpel, and then it travels down the style, which is just a tube that connects the stigma to the ovary down here. And once the pollen reaches the ovary, it can be fertilized, and then it will grow into another flower. So talking about germination and seeds, right, we said pollen is the male reproductive cell in flowering plants, and the ovule is the female reproductive cell. So before, when we were talking about animals, we said sperm for male and egg for female. But in plants, it's pollen and ovule. So it's still sexual reproduction because we are exchanging gametes, right, from male and female. There are two parents used in reproduction here for the plants. So when the egg in the ovary becomes pollinated, the ovary turns into what we call a fruit, and the fruit protects the seed and helps to distribute seeds. So when we are eating fruit, whether it is a peach or an apple or a strawberry, we are helping to distribute the seeds for that plant. So fruits are very beneficial, again, because they protect the seed and they help with dispersal. So animals will eat the seed, and then they pass through that animal's digestive system. They get released with the feces or the poop from the animal, and now that seed has a nice bit of fertilizer to help it get started. So there are many different types of seeds, but we're going to take a look at just two examples here. So how do you think these seeds are dispersed? So let's start with this first seed over here on the left. So this seed has little tiny, you can see they're kind of hooks. So this seed will get caught on the fur of different animals. Again, maybe it's a bee or a bird or a bear. And then that animal will transport them from one place to another. So let's say that a bear goes walking by, it gets this seed caught on its leg, and then it goes and it scratches its leg on a tree, and then the seed falls off. So it's been moved from one place to another. This seed right here will be dispersed using the wind. So we can see where this seed has this almost wing-like projection, it gets caught and carried by the wind to help transport it to a new place where it can grow. So seeds have developed all sorts of different tricks or adaptations to help them be dispersed so that they can not all grow in basically the same region. Because remember, there's always going to be competition for resources, whether those resources are nutrients in the soil or the amount of sunlight that's available. So having seeds that can be dispersed farther away can help make sure that those seeds have access to enough resources that they can actually survive. So that is it for these notes on plant adaptations. We recapped our transport or vascular tissues and reproduction. If you have any questions or concerns about these notes, please let me know.